to present their webinar in collaboration with Fakultas Hukum Universitas 11 Maret called The Human Right to Health Solidarity in the Era of Healthcare Commercialization. And my name is Sakarmentari Hendrajano, batch of 2019 from the Faculty of Law, Universitas 11 Maret, will be your moderator for today. We would like to also remind you that this webinar event is currently streaming live on YouTube, and today's webinar will be filled by Dr. Eduardo Arenas Catalan, Assistant Professor of Public International Law, Department of Criminal, International and European Law from the Open University, the Netherlands. And before we proceed, firstly, we would like to give time and place to Dr. Awaluddin Marwan, SHMH, to give a glimpse of his opening remarks. Mr. Awaluddin, the time and place is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Scar, for a very good opening speech. And also would like to thank you all for Dr. Eduardo, my beloved brothers living in Netherlands. Good morning there. And also thank you for the times and opportunity to Professor Ayu. Very happy and glad to work with Professor Ayu and the team, especially Universitas 11 Maret law schools. And this forum is very important because during the pandemic, we know that the healthcare is very important. I think this is the first fundamental right that we have to fulfill beside education and food, because if we are not healthy, and then our money and everything's like meaningless. So Eduardo book is very relevant, and I know him. He wrote a PhD thesis on the right to health. He's very expert on this area, so we can learn the theory and practice concerning the right to health, and we can adopt it. We can be adopted the concept of the right to health in the Indonesia situations. I hope this forum also as the first forum that will be continue after this with joint research and joint publications, and also following lecture and seminars. Again, thank you. Muchas gracias to Edo, because Edo also from Latin America. And I was in Spain for a couple of years to do my master's and learn some Spanish word just a bit, and now I forgot all my Spanish word. But I'm happy when I was in Utrecht with Edo, and I practiced my Spanish. Even though he replied in English, because he know that my Spanish is so bad, but at least it remind me something about Spain. To participants, enjoy the forums. We can learn a lot from Edo, and that's all for me. Thank you, Scar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awaluddin, for your opening remark. Now I would like to give the Dean of Universitas 11 Maret's Faculty of Law, Professor Dr. I Gusti Ayu Ketutrahmi Handayani SHMM, or as known as Prof. Ayu, her time and place to give her opening remark as well. Now, Prof. Ayu is the Professor of State Administrative Law since 2016, who has pursued her Bachelor's of Law Studies in Universitas 11 Maret, Surakarta, her master's in management in the University of Leeds, United Kingdom, and her doctoral studies of law in Universitas Gadjah Mada, Yogyakarta. So, Prof. Ayu, good afternoon. Represent that the time and place is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mbak Sekar. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning in Netherlands and good afternoon in Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to Book Club Discussion, the human rights to health solidarity in the era of healthcare commercialization. I'm very thankful to you, Dr. Eduardo Arenas Catalan. He's an assistant professor of public international law department of criminal international and European law, Open University, Netherlands. And thankful to Dr. Marwan, my colleague, to arrange this forum. I also wish to thank to the committee who have organized this wonderful event. Finally, I hope we can cooperation with another event, especially for Dr. Eduardo, as joint publication, guest lecture, joint research, and I hope we invite you as a speaker in conference, in international conference, or as an external examiner in scripsi, thesis, and dissertation in PhD defense in School of Law, Universitas 11 Maret. Once again, welcome and thank you very much for attending this event. And that's all. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Prof. Ayu, for the gracious opening remarks. Now, before getting to the core of the event, allow me to introduce what HALAW is first. So HALAW Indonesia is a platform that contains legal consultation where it will bring clients with legal experts together by online in Indonesia, where in addition, HALAW also has several services such as legal consultation, HALAW Edu, which is an online learning platform provided by HALAW, and also Indonesian Dutch legal dictionaries. So to get the features provided by HALAW Indonesia, you can always download our apps on Play Store or App Store. So now entering to the second agenda of our event, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Eduardo for a special event today. He's an assistant professor at the Open University in the Department of Criminal, International, and European Law. Dr. Eduardo's main research interest lies in the intersection between human rights under international law and social justice. And prior to joining the Open University, he worked as a lecturer at Leiden Law School and at the Utrecht School of Law in the field of European and international human rights law. Dr. Eduardo grew up and studied law in Chile and obtained both his cum laude and PhD from Utrecht University. And his doctoral thesis was awarded the 2018 Theo van Boven Mastery Research Prize of International Law. And looking at the emerging principle of solidarity, this work provided a critical assessment of the predominant interpretation of access to healthcare as a human right under international law. So good afternoon, Dr. Eduardo. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So we would like to present you that the time and place is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sekar. Thank you so much, my dear friend Awaladin, Dr. Awaladin Mohamed, and Dean of the Law School authorities and friends of Indonesia. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to take part in this event. Thank you so much for inviting me. As I was saying at the beginning, I with my Indonesian friends, have been trying to organize something together for a long time, and I am extremely happy that finally this is happening. My apologies for the fact that we couldn't organize it in the initial date that we had programmed, but I was simply unable to talk as I felt sick that time. But now I'm much better, as you can hear, and well, it's a great pleasure to be here, even if I'm at home, to be connected through the online world together with all of you, and also streaming live on YouTube. I find it really nice. I'm going to share my screen to a presentation I have prepared for today. If I'm not mistaken, you should be able to see it now. Am I right, Sekar?
Yes.
Great. And how much time do I have?
45 minutes, sir.
Okay, great. I think I might be able to do it in less than that. Maybe not. I will try to do it quickly. And if there are any questions from the audience, you can do them immediately. Otherwise, at the end, it's also good. So what I have in this presentation is essentially a presentation about my book, which will come published in June with Edward Elgar Publishers. Here you see a photo of the cover, and here is the website where you can, in June you will be able to download this book, because it will be provided open access, courtesy of the Open University, in particular our library services and great colleagues who have made this possible. So here's the website. In June you will be able to download it and perhaps make more sense of what I will be explaining today. Essentially, what I want to do is to begin with a number of considerations about why I embarked in this project. Later, a couple of methodological caveats, namely how I did it. I think it's important to mention this point because this is a critical work. Then I will tell you the official story of human rights. Human rights as they are greatly understood all over the world, and also by the interpretative bodies that are in charge of this task. And finally, the critique that this book brings concerning human rights. So this is a book that goes in favor of human rights, but which in some respects challenges some of the perspectives that we have to understand what human rights are. So let me begin with why I embarked into this job. And the reason, as it was mentioned in the introduction, has very much to do with the part of the world where I come from. As it was mentioned by Sekar, I come from Chile in South America. I was born there, and I lived there for 30 years before I began my Dutch chapter in my life. And what we see still there is, on the one hand, a very powerful idea of human rights. Human rights are essentially protected in Chile in the way in which they should be protected according to the authorities, according to those that are in charge of interpreting what human rights are. But this lives together with enormous inequalities. Chile is actually one of the most unequal countries in the world. And the result of all this is to live in a state or in a country with two worlds, and also a country with two institutions or two types of institutions. Institutions for the very rich and institutions for the poor. And I think that from the point of view of human rights, this is a problem. Traditional interpretations of human rights don't make of this much of a problem. And this is one of the things that I wanted to question in my book, because I believe that the original questions of social rights are linked with these economic inequalities. In other words, if the project of human rights law is not going to deliver social justice, I think it will remain to be a weak project, a flawed project, and also a project that is not in line with what brought human rights to come into existence. So how did I carry out this research? I think it's always important. Many times we speak of human rights, and as the notion itself mentions it, this is something that it's supposed to cover all of us. After all of us are humans. But actually, many of a great part of the history on how human rights were constructed took part in the West, took part in Europe. It came from notions that existed in Europe and in the United States, and in a story, in a history that has not been always easy, actually the contrary. So what is it actually meant by human rights, and what notions and what philosophies and what historical developments are the ones that are considered, and which are the ones that are not considered when we are talking of human rights, is a very crucial issue, and that has implications on what finally human rights mean. So this is a book that emerges from a perspective, a critical theory perspective, which begins from in the South. I come, as I mentioned, from Chile. Today we speak of the global South. You can also speak of the poorer nations or underdeveloped countries. All these concepts have problems. They can be criticized. I am mostly comfortable with the South, although many countries are that are underdeveloped are also in the Northern Hemisphere. So this is again a problematic category. But in my study, for example, I also looked at Chile, at Cuba, at Colombia, at Peru, a number of South Africa, a number of countries, India, that have something to do with the South, and that bring also their perspective into the discussion. So this was for me very important. But not just this, but also the focus that I adopted in my book. The first thing is the idea that, and you see it many times in many narratives of people speaking about human rights, that if you speak of human rights, it means automatically that your narrative is a narrative with merit that deserves somehow praise. And this is, I think, self-satisfying perspective that is not always the case. At the end of the day, what deserves merit is that what helps peoples to develop themselves. And if certain human rights perspectives are not in line with those objectives, there is room for criticism. So I took account of that into my work. Secondly, what I saw as a tension between human rights on the one hand as a notion that pre-exists politics, and what I just mentioned, the development of a country is something that cannot be disconnected from its political development. So if human rights are a notion, which by the way is not one which emerges much from what our peoples think or are worried about, and it's going to be imposed on them, to what extent will this definition serve the interests of these peoples? So that took me to adopt a different perspective towards politics, or what in constitutional law is considered weak perspectives of human rights. Namely, Human rights are important. Human rights deserve protection, but the way in which we incorporate them has to do something also with the country that is going to do that. And finally, the notion that in the case of social rights, as I mentioned, this book is about the right to health, which is a social right. The principle that best interprets this human right is solidarity. And the question that I wanted to analyze in my book in particular was, in what way would solidarity give weight to the duties and institutions that make the right to health possible? So this is essentially how I carried this work. And now I want to move to the way in which it is told that the story is, to later move to the way in which I think the story should be. Now, whether or not the story should be in a particular way, it's something that is open to criticism, but this is also the role of people that are in the academia, to look at the materials that we have in the law, to critically assess them, to put them, to compare them with the realities that we have in the world, and in particular in our countries, and to determine, as a result of our thinking, of our collective thinking, whether or not those solutions that are being told to us that will deal with the problems are or not the correct ones. At this point, I would perhaps like to make a caveat, in the sense that what I wanted to do in this presentation was to talk about my book, which was a book that I finished writing before the pandemic. So I will not make comments about the pandemic. In any case, I think that we are in a moment where there is so much discussion about COVID-19 that it is somehow becoming a monopoly in the discussion. Having said that, I do think that many of the things that this book is about have to do with the poor way in which the pandemic has been dealt with. I am sure that if we were to have a solidaristic perspective about health, the way in which the countries and the international community in general would have handled the pandemic would have been much better. So I'll begin with the official story, which is something that takes me to the Bill of Human Rights. As you know, the Bill of Human Rights is comprised, on the one hand, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and two legally binding covenants on human rights, one on civil and political rights and another one on economic, social, and cultural rights, what we know as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, this treaty, this multilateral treaty, is a very important one. In Article 12, it enshrines the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And as such, this is a very powerful legal expression of the right to health. It's the most important norm that we have in international law regarding this human right. And the body, which is the legal body, which is in charge of interpreting this covenant and also the obligations of Article 12, is the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So I have talked about Article 12, where the right to health is enshrined, but there's also another provision which is very important, which is the provision of Article 2.1 of this international covenant. Why do I say that this provision is so important? Because it is the mechanism, the methodology that this international treaty has to carry out to tell to the states that sign this treaty, how they need to bring about and pull forward in the accomplishment of the obligations. So one thing is, what rights you sign for. But another thing is the operative clause, something that is very important for lawyers, to what extent you should respect those rights. And this is something that is specified in this provision of Article 2.1. Now, here I have discussed these two brothers, right, or sisters, whatever you want to call it, treaties. On the one hand, the one on civil and political rights, and on the other hand, the one on economic, social, and cultural rights. Well, whereas the one on civil and political rights speaks of respecting and ensuring, and that's why I was saying that lawyers, that this is a discussion for lawyers, because words are very important. Respect and ensure, that is what it says, the one on civil and political rights, and the one on economic, social, and cultural rights speaks of taking steps. You see, there's a big difference. Respecting and ensuring is much more powerful than taking steps, because, you know, if you increase the budget of, just to put an example, if you increase the budget of the Ministry of Health in $1, you could say that you are taking steps towards the promotion and respect and protection and fulfillment of the right to health. I mean, maybe you will have to say, no, but that's ridiculous. Okay, but it could be interpreted in that way. So taking steps is, as a legal language, a much more vague language than respecting and ensuring. Of course, we can enter also in discussion about what respecting and ensure is and ensure entails. But I think we all can agree that there is an asymmetry between these two languages. Now, you may wonder, well, why this asymmetry? Is it not so that in 1993 we came with an agreement in a World Summit of Human Rights that all rights were important, so-called human rights indivisibility, equally important? The story is always complicated, and that was why I was talking about the necessity of going into these different stories. Let me tell you a bit about this. So this language of taking steps comes together with another notion, the notion of progressive realization. So you take steps towards the progressive realization of all the rights that are enshrined in the International Economic and Social and Cultural Rights Covenant. Now, what is progressive realization? So we go from vague statement into vague statement. Truth being told, it is very difficult to do so otherwise. I mean, even if you have a treaty with 1,000 provisions, you will still create doubts. So this is a legal limitation no matter what. But in this case, the body in charge of interpreting what these notions of taking steps and progressive realization and also the more substantive provisions actually mean is the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which in its different general comments and also concluding observations has been specifying what this actually means. There are other bodies that also have a role here, like the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, and also the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, which issue different reports, and also other legal specialized organizations associated with the UN, which have been in charge of giving meaning to these different provisions, or that have engaged in the debate in trying to understand what they actually mean. But one crucial one crucial legal material to understand what this actually means is so-called General Comment 3, issued by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in the year 1990. Now, if you go to this General Comment and you look in particular to its different paragraphs, you see that in paragraph 8, there is what could be understood as some sort of political neutrality, namely the idea that you can develop these human rights, including the ones in this treaty, in any political framework. So from socialism to capitalism and everything in between and everything beyond, you should be able to develop human rights, provided that all human rights are respected and considered on an equal basis. This is a problematic perspective, I would argue, but I will not have much time to develop it. I just wanted to mention this, that at least in principle, you can have a system of strong capitalist characteristics and still, in principle, not enter into a violation of the treaty. Another important element is it's enshrined in paragraph 10 of this document. Here you have the so-called minimum core doctrine, which means that I was putting the example of the $1, right? You have the budget of the Ministry of Health, which is, I don't know, $10 million per month, per year. That's nothing. But let's imagine that just for the sake of argument. And you increase it in $1. Well, you could say, I am taking steps towards the protection of the right to health. But actually, this perspective of the minimum core doctrine, namely that every right has a minimum, some sort of threshold where you cannot go beyond, you cannot go underneath, so to say, means that you need to, in order to, for the state that signs this treaty, in order to protect this human right, you need to ensure the satisfaction of the minimum essential levels of each right. And that the state that signs this treaty would be failing, in principle, to discharge its obligations whenever it does not guarantee essential foodstuffs or essential primary care or basic shelter or basic education. So here you have a different perspective. It is not anymore this counter argument, okay, I've increased the budget in $1. No, sir. Here the point is not whether or not you are, for progressive realization to happen, it's not enough to just increase with $1 or with $10 or with $100 million. The point is more whether or not you are satisfying a minimum essential level of each right. That would be this contribution of paragraph 10, what came to be the so-called minimum core doctrine. Now, I will argue that this perspective has a number of problems. I will argue that later. But this, as I had told you, but this is an important way of understanding what this covenant actually means. As I had mentioned in passing, there have been also concluding observations, which are also reports that the same body writes about different countries in particular, trying to detect whether or not the implementation of these rights is going correctly. And here I've chosen two of them, one on China and another one on Chile. In the one on China, at some point, the committee said, despite the expansion of hospitals, there is a lack of doctors who are absorbed into the higher paying private health sector. I'm slightly starting to introduce where I want to go. You will see later. And the one on Chile said, the trend towards privatization in the healthcare sector seem to have made health services too costly for a part of the population. And you also have another general comment. So after the one of 1990, you have the one 10 years after, the one in 2000, which is a special general comment dedicated to the right to health, General Comment 14, by the same body. And one important consideration that they introduced was the notion of affordability, namely that the healthcare services need to be payable, need to be affordable. Otherwise, they are inaccessible. In this respect, this particular general comment made a remark concerning the trend of privatization, which, as you know, requires to make public healthcare services private. The definition is a bit more complicated than that, but I don't have time to develop it. But for the purposes of what I'm saying, this is enough. Now, as I studied in my book, the problem with privatization is not a problem with privatization itself. So you don't have, you are not failing to comply with the treaty if you privatize small or large swaths of the public healthcare sector infrastructure. It only becomes a legal issue if by virtue of those actions you threaten the accessibility of the right to health. Now, what does that mean? I concluded in my book that that happens whenever those that are not able to purchase social rights by themselves are devoid of healthcare services. Now, this leads into a very legalistic perspective of what the right of the way in which the right to health is to be protected. And you may say, well, that's great because we are all lawyers and we all want justice. And what we want to do is to actually utilize the tools of the law in order to protect human rights. And how are we going to do that? Well, we have a number of focuses. I've already mentioned the minimum core doctrine. So whenever a state goes underneath that minimum, it's if the state is unable to, for example, to provide essential primary care, we could say prima facie there is a violation of the right to health. So we just need to look on that. Another one is, what about the vulnerable populations? What about, and the committee gives endless examples of vulnerable populations. You can imagine, for example, sex workers. You can imagine, for example, people that belong to minorities, or you can imagine people with disabilities that have different challenges in accessing the right to health. Another important factor is non-discrimination. You should not discriminate against people, and whenever you're discriminating against people, you are essentially violating the right to health. Now, these are definitely important contributions because they have helped us to put the emphasis on those that, in a way, needed the most. So without this focus, or thanks to this focus, it is that social rights have become something important. Before this focus, social rights were actually not very much present in the discussion, but now they are. Let me see how I am on the time. 9:45, I still have 15 minutes. I will not manage to make it shorter, I'm afraid, but I will finish at 10. What are the effects of all these that we have been discussing here under the perspective of human rights as they are officially interpreted? The first thing is that there is a focus on demand, so to say, rather than a focus on supply. I'm speaking a very commercial economic language, but I hope to make sense of this. What I mean is that if you are going to, as a state, protect the right to health enshrined in this treaty, what you need to do is actually, as we were seeing here, put the emphasis in those that need to access healthcare services. So as long as you focus on the vulnerable, as long as you focus on a minimum core of the right, as long as you make sure to not fall into discrimination, as long as you make sure that whenever you privatize, not a problem with privatization, but if you privatize, you ensure that these minimum services are given, you're kind of okay. But this also means that the focus of human rights, the way they are officially understood, is not about building institutions that are in charge of protecting the right to health. Yeah. Now, for somebody who is new to the human rights world, this might sound a little bit strange, because if I would be new to the world of human rights, I would think, okay, there is a thing called right to health. I guess that has to do with protecting the places where, if we talk about healthcare, where I get healthcare. And where do I get healthcare? Well, in a hospital. So I guess that the right to health has to be about protecting hospitals. Well, it's not actually about that. It's more about protecting the demand, and in particular, those that are not able by themselves to protect social rights, to get social rights. Now, the problem of this perspective is that, as I was mentioning here, let me get back to my beginning. I was worried. What brought me to write about this was these economic inequalities. So it's not that in Chile or many countries like that, like Colombia or South Africa or India, there is not a public health infrastructure. It exists. But the gap between those that have a lot of money to purchase social rights and those that don't is increasing, is becoming each time wider. And I was trying to investigate to what extent is that a human rights problem? So the problem of this focus on demand that focuses on these minimums is that it actually doesn't help to bring these two people together. Now, this is something that you might not agree with, but what I see, what I've been seeing in my research is that essentially this perspective is greatly compatible with a private right to healthcare. There's a nice example of this. I should have put here the Canadian flag of a case called Shauli, which was a case decided in 2007 by the Supreme Court of Canada. And that case is interesting because by virtue of classical provisions of the Quebec Constitution and the Canadian Constitution associated with liberty and security of the person, essentially a person was able to make a human rights argument to private health. Now, I would argue that these kind of developments are not helping us to make this gap smaller. Actually, they are making it bigger, and they are utilizing human rights for something that is not in line with these original questions of equality for all. I would perhaps need to explain a little bit about the case, and I will do so very briefly, just to give you a bit of context. It was a situation of a person who needed a hip surgery, and by virtue of provisions in Canada, this person was not able to do so because there was a prohibition of doing it privately. So the person could do it publicly, but had to wait for a long list. And the person had the money, so his problem was, why am I going to be waiting? In other countries, actually, he made the argument, like the United States, I would be able to access this operation immediately. So why can I not get it? And this is the interesting point of solidarity, I think, which is that the fact that you have money in your pockets does not give you the right to jump the queue. Now, what I find problematic of this is that the court started to actually buy into these arguments and started to say, oh, that's true. In the United States, actually, this person would be able to access this surgery, avoiding the problematic fact that the United States system of healthcare was in those years one of the most inefficient in the world, namely a system that invests huge amounts of money, but with very poor results. So out of all the places where the Canadians decided to look, they looked actually at the worst place. What I find problematic of this is that if you are going to be having a right to choose, if that is a right, namely a right to choose with whom you are going to be treated, this should be a right for all, and not just for those that have money. Because if you make of that a human right, it essentially means that human rights are for those with power. And that is precisely the opposite of what human rights should be about. At the same time, if you have a right to exit the public healthcare system and essentially do things private, what is that but the expression of privilege? Of course, those that have money want to exit the public healthcare system because in the private healthcare system, their priorities are going to have more priority. But this is problematic because the whole point of human rights is to actually make sure that the priorities of the poor are put forward. There's another case that it's important for me to build my argument, which is a case from South Africa, Subramoni. This case was about a person that had kidney disease. This person was treated in the private healthcare sector, but at some point this person ran out of money, so went to the public healthcare sector. And in the public healthcare sector, they told him, sorry, sir, but according to the guidelines of our hospital, you are not entitled to protection because of the fact that we can only prolong your life. We cannot really make you recover really from this disease. And the chemotherapy that we have here is only for people that actually can be recovered, because we have too little machines. We don't have enough resources. Now, the entire world, human rights world community criticized this decision. And I think that there are reasons to criticize it, but not those reasons. I think that the reasons why it should be criticized, I think that it should not be criticized by the fact that this tragic situation happened. I think that it's terrible that this situation happened. But to make it better, you don't have to just, I think, inject money in the public healthcare sector, because then essentially you are going to keep on making this gap between these two sets of people. I think that the question that was legally relevant was the question of why was it the case that Mr. Subramani was not able to get these medicines, whereas other people in the private sector were able to do that. The court never looked into this question. And I think that this is the question that, for me, to make human rights something that is equal for all, is the relevant question. If we want to stop this dynamic of increasing the parallelism between the public and the private healthcare sector, we need to put more attention into these questions. Let me now go to end with my critical perspective of what we have been looking at about the official story. My critical perspective would be that in order to bring social rights back to their origins, their roots, we need to apply something beyond this perspective of non-discrimination, minimum core doctrine, and the vulnerable. We need to, as lawyers, be able to understand that the problem of the right to health is something that goes beyond courts. It tackles courts. It has to do with what we do intrinsically, but not just that. It's something beyond. If we really want to protect everybody and to focus on the poor, and at the same time build cohesive societies run by the principle of solidarity. And I think that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we cannot leave politics out of this. The right to health, if it is to be understood as something associated with not just the demand, but also the supply, has to look into the principles of distributive justice that make the right to health possible. And also, we need to look at the trade-offs. I was mentioning the case of Subramani, and that is a very difficult trade-off. The hospital was saying, sorry, sir, we cannot give you, we need to focus on the people that have the option to make it. And I would say that, tragic as it is, that decision, what's really tragic is the fact that South Africa has a legislation that makes this gap between these two people. So whereas Mr. Subramani was given this terrible answer, other people could access any healthcare they wanted by virtue of South African legislation. So I find more problematic the trade-off, that trade-off, that the trade-off of Subramani not being able to access public healthcare. And at the same time, we need to focus on collective remedies. And in this sense, I would look again at the case that I give you in Canada. For example, there was this deterrence to make health private, and that provision was wiped out by the court. But actually, the result of that was that the Canadian system in those years was one of the most effective systems in the world, because of the fact that, and the most efficient in the world. So to do the most amount of things with the least amount of money. Of course, there are problems like the issue of waiting lists, and that is something that we need to improve. But I think it was going in the right direction, because of the fact that healthcare was not made something that could be dealt with by the market. This all takes me to what I was saying before, that rather than a focus on demand, if we really want to protect the right to health in line with solidarity, we need to focus on supply. In other words, If we're going to focus on healthcare, we need to focus on the institution of the national healthcare system. And here I have a picture of one of my legal heroes, Professor Fernando Atria, who is a Chilean legal scholar, who says that we need to pay attention to the principles of distribution according to which we are going to run healthcare. And if we think that the principle of distribution that most efficiently distributes healthcare is the market, well, I think that we are failing to understand what the market does. What the market does is to make it accessible for whatever price a person wants to charge for a service or a good, the market price. But that price does not necessarily coincide with a need which is supposed to be delivered in equal and universal terms. That is, after all, what the right to health means. The right to health means that if there is something called the right to health, it means that you are going to deliver access to it universally and equally. But you cannot do that when somebody decides to charge for that something that is higher than what a person can pay. He also provides the example of Brown versus Board of Education, which is a classical case of the United States about education, which doesn't have much to do with the right to health, but it's interesting because one of the things that it is said is that, no, what matters here is to provide the same quality. So as long as the quality is the same, we are all fine. To what extent this is true, I think that Brown versus Board of Education, according to Adria, helps to show it. And the reason was that the segregated blacks that couldn't access education in the years 50s and in the 50s and in the 60s were not just demanding equal quality. They were demanding not to be segregated. And what is happening here is something very similar. Under the allure of the point of quality, which could be, it is not, but which could be the same, you are told that you should remain in the public healthcare sector and that people should not be mixed. I think that this is a good example of how this doctrine is incorrect. He says also that what you need to provide is political priority to these groups. And the way to do so is not just by creating a system that is going to tackle exclusively their needs. No, if you want to put the incentive, if you want to put the focus on those that don't have anything, you need to make sure actually to provide an incentive for those that do have a lot to give something to them. Now, do you provide an incentive if you have two separated systems, one that tackles with the poor and then one which tackles with the rich? Absolutely no. The rich are just going to want to make their system better and not care about the needs of the poor. But if everybody is under the same system, for the rich to get better healthcare, they will have to improve the system of everybody, including that of the poor. So under the notion of a national healthcare system, you can do such a thing. This requires you to constitutionalize an equal right to healthcare, which is something that you, of course, do in the Constitution. You should make sure to provide a public service run on the basis of principles of public health. This is where I'm saying that we lawyers know a lot, but not everything. We could also do with the point of view of public health experts. And if we need to take an example from something, we could look at the traditional way in which the National Health Service was run in Britain, where all the needs of everyone's needs were focused on, and where the services were free of charge at the point of delivery, and where distribution was based on need and not on ability to pay. So back to, and that is the reason why I have this long arrow, back to the point of progressive realization in the context of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. What will progressive realization mean under a perspective of solidarity? I would say that it would mean to leave aside this notion of affordability that focuses only on the vulnerable, and to increasingly socialize access to healthcare for everyone, not something that asks you first, okay, do you belong to the group of the poor or to the group of the rich, before you can have human rights. I think it is a much better approach. And if you want to read all about it, here's the link to my book. It will be made public. It will be made open access, so you will be able to look at it in detail and to evaluate the arguments that I have made there. So I think I will leave it at this, and thank you so much for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eduardo, for the incredible presentation. So before we actually move on to the third agenda of our webinar, I would like to obtain several insights based from the presentation that you have delivered. So to obtain equality in human rights is one of the most crucial aspects in order to have a structured society with susceptible amount of welfare. But the huge contradictory between the rich and the poor is getting notorious and rapidly increased as time goes by. And you have also mentioned that the trend towards privatization of the healthcare sector seemed to have made healthcare services to be too costly for a part of the population. And you have also justified the concept of human rights as well. And as we know that the human rights are a vital tool for us to prosper, to prevent an unjust life. And you argued that if there are any inquiries in regards of the human rights notion, whether if it's politically or socio-economically, dissenting to several parties, then there will always be a room of critique towards it. And we also know that, some people also misinterpret the concept between political neutrality, because you previously has also mentioned in regards of political neutrality. So according to my research, some people misinterpret the essence and the existence of political neutrality with impartiality. So if may I clarify, what are the actual differences in between political neutrality and also impartiality? Thank you.
Thank you, Sekar, for that great intervention, which I think summarizes several of the points I've been making. And I indeed think that the interesting point to which we more urgently than ever need to take the right to health and social rights in general is to make them take charge of the plutocratic and oligarchic characteristics that our societies are unfortunately acquiring. If we are not going to say that human rights takes issue with that, then at this point, the question is really, well, then what is the point of human rights? And as Professor Samuel Moyn shows really well in his book, Not Enough Equality in an Unequal Human Rights in an Unequal World, he shows how these perspectives, which were very much associated with the concerns of the South, where Indonesia has a particularly important place in history, they wanted, these countries of the South wanted to bring notions of equality into the agenda of what human rights were going to be about. But they were constantly put out of the agenda of what human rights are. So in a way, it's not a surprise that we are today in the situation where we are. And I think that in order to get out of this crisis, an important and crucial contribution can come from the human rights world by incorporating these views about the gap between the rich and poor as something that has to do something with human rights. And back to your question, let me say that I don't think that the point, your question on political neutrality and impartiality, I don't think that the notion of solidarity is an impartial notion, but I don't think that actually any political notion is really impartial. Take the notion of equality. In the 18th century, when monarchs were declaring that their power came directly from God, and as a result, they were in a special position with respect to their subjects. Such a notion of equality was controversial. Today is the political lexicon of any major organization, even those that have nothing to do with human rights, and even those that are opposed to human rights. They respect the principle of equality. So today this has become impartial, although if you look at it from a historical perspective, it was not. And the same, I would argue, happens with solidarity. Today, those that have a lot don't want to lose what they have. And if somebody comes to say, no, human rights should be interpreted in line with solidarity, they are going to say, well, that's partial. I would say, yeah, it is partial. But we need this partiality in order to restore harmony in this unequal world. So I think that the important thing is to bring the correct partiality, a partiality that is able to serve as an antidote to the diseases, to the social diseases that we currently have, poverty, inequality, results also of the violent way in which the world has been divided. We still are paying the consequences of war, of new wars, of old wars and new wars, of colonialism, and also of apartheid. So these are remaining problems. And to put it finally a little bit more concretely in terms of political neutrality, if you want to ask me for a polemic question, I don't like to dodge those questions. Yeah, I do think that it is highly problematic to have a system of unfettered capitalism in line with human rights. The covenant and the general comment speaks of the need of a system that systematically serves the project of rights. In the context of the right to health, I understand this as a national healthcare service. So far, we've been very good at understanding this in the context of civil and political rights. So, for example, access to justice. Could we imagine today access to justice as a human right without the existence of the judiciary? I don't think so. I don't think that any notion of democracy can survive with the idea of separation of powers and an independent judiciary. Well, the same goes for socially apt societies. If we want to say that the right to health is a human right, we cannot do without a strong national healthcare service, public and free for all. And as important, it is as important as an independent judiciary. If you want to protect social rights, you need to have a national healthcare service, free and public for all.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Eduardo. Personally, I also completely agree with you that we can conclude that basically the human rights are a political legal construct that emerged under particular circumstances due to various differences of ideologies, customs, procedures, regulations, and etc. And I personally think that with a good philosophical theory of human rights, it should be responsive to this type of issue and this type of fact that has been occurring nowadays in the world that's revolving around us. So now we are entering to the third agenda of our event today, which is the question and answer session, which I would like to remind the audience again that if you would like to deliver any question in regards of Dr. Eduardo's delivery of material, you can always write your questions on the comment section and I will read it out one by one. Or if you prefer, you can also straight away turn on your microphone and introduce yourself and straight away deliver to your questions. Thank you.
Mrs. Moderators, I would like to deliver my questions.
Yes, you may proceed.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon and good morning for Mr. Eduardo. Before I deliver my questions, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Muhammad Davaris Kitama. I studied in Faculty of Law Universitas Maret, and I'm about to enter my fourth year in law school this year. If you don't mind, I would like to ask you two questions. First, Recently, the Indonesian government is conducting a vaccinations programs, and the government itself promised that all the people will be vaccinated according to their needs and a certain requirements made by the governments. The vaccine will be free and available to everyone. Nevertheless, the governments of Indonesia also enacting a policy that give a possibilities for certain organizations, especially a company who runs the private sector, to conduct their own vaccination program for their own employees, especially. This program is called Vaksin Gotong Royong, or in English we call it Solidarity Vaccines Program. And there is a widespread protest and critics regarding of these programs, especially among the human rights activists and epidemiologists. They are arguing that these programs might cause a discrimination as disproportionate distribution of vaccine. However, the governments argue that these programs are based on the necessity to rebuild and recover the economy. And is it a part of the collaborations of public and private sector to tackle the virus? So my question is, based on this context and situations, can we consider the solidarity vaccine programs or vaccine gotong royong as part of a solidarity, or it is otherwise? It's part of discriminations. And now I would like to moving on to my second questions. There is critics regarding universal and free healthcare policy. The notion itself, based on the economics perspective, universal and free healthcare may cause a dependency, the reduce of health measures quality, and also burdens a state's budget. For example, like in Indonesia, we are facing a huge problems regarding our state's budgets, and also there's certain examples while the patients needs to provide their own medicines, even though they are already become the part of the national health care programs. And my question is actually it's very simple. Is there any international law or rules which regulates the standardizations of the health measures, and the regulation itself is made to reduce the side effect? Or if it's not, do you have a suggestions to the governments to reduce this effect? Thank you, Mr. Eduardo and Mrs. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Muhammad. Dr. Eduardo, you may proceed.
Thank you. Thank you for this question, Mr. Dafa. And I didn't understand the second question very well, so we can go to it later. But as to the first question, I think that if the government is coming out with universal program of vaccination, well, that's great news. And what activists should do is to make sure that it remains to be universal. I think that one of the useful things that we have from the classical human rights perspective applied to social rights is the point of non-discrimination. So this is not something that will serve us to make this equality of condition that I was speaking about, but the most classical sense of equality. So if there is a group of the population that due to different reasons associated with their ethnicity or whatever it is, that they are put out of the program, that is a classical challenge to the principle of non-discrimination, and the government should be held accountable for that. And activists should make sure that everybody gets the vaccination at the same time. So yeah, no, if you call it solidarity, it's not necessarily solidaristic. For it to become solidaristic, you need to make sure that that it is as solidaristic as a practical matter. And if you're going to say, by virtue of this program, this population, or by practical, by the practice of the health practitioners, a group of the population is put out or not given the same priority, then you have a challenge, and that should be put an end to. That could not be called solidaristic. As to the second question, I didn't totally get it. So maybe you can say something more about it.
Actually, like I right now I'm conducting. I was one of the part team of the competitions, which talking about health regulations. So I'm kind of curious: is there any certain international conventions or rules? Like, is there any conventions or protocols or at least recommendations that's made by certain bodies, like particularly like WHO or UNSCR, that that standardize the requirements of not the requirements, just standardizations of good healthcare. So there is no reduce of healthcare qualities, and which it can cause. In my perspective, it can cause a discriminations because there's a lot of people, especially in my country, in Indonesia, when they are already become the part of the international, the national healthcare systems, but sometimes they need to provide their own medicines because the governments cannot provide it, and because of these problems, if it's there's no if it's there's no certain international of basis, do you have any suggestions to our governments to tackle these issues? Because this is one of the reasons why sometimes people doesn't really want to join the national health programs, Mr. Eduardo. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now I understand the question better, but unfortunately, I'm not in the position to answer it properly. I haven't studied in detail the Indonesian healthcare system. I looked at a few things before this presentation, and I was thinking at some point to make arguments about the situation in Indonesia, but I decided in the end not to do so and prefer to concentrate exclusively on what the book would be about. I prefer not to comment about this now, not to say that I would not want to do it in the future, because I frankly do not have enough knowledge. The situation in Indonesia is a huge country. It's also a country that it's not just, you know, like many countries are, one piece of land. No, it's so many islands and with so many different realities and so many languages, so much diversity. Which enriches the country, but also makes problems sometimes a little bit more difficult. So I think that the challenge to make this old 1980s WHO motto of health for all is a particularly challenging one, among other reasons, because the very same agency, the WHO, has now moved to universal healthcare coverage, which is a more difficult notion because it doesn't specify very much how the resources are going to be brought together. So it doesn't take issue against the private provision of healthcare. And in principle, I don't have problems with the private provision of healthcare. The problem comes that many times it comes with a conditionality, which is money. And if that conditionality is as a result going to be segregating people, then you have a problem. So, but the reality is way more complicated than that, and that's the point of your question. So I'm afraid that for this occasion, I will not be able to answer it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eduardo, for answering Mr. Dafa's questions. So I would like to remind again to the audience, if there is any other questions that you would like to deliver in regards of Dr. Eduardo's delivery of material, you can always write down your questions down to the comment section, whether if it's in Indonesian or English, and I will read it out one by one. Or if you like to prefer, you can right away unmute your microphone and also talk directly while introducing yourself. And after that, you can deliver your questions straight away. So I would like to firstly check the comment section if there is any questions that are given. All right. So considering that our time is entering to 4:30 p.m. in Indonesia, and probably it's still morning in Mr. Eduardo's place, so I actually would like to ask another question in terms of the material that you have delivered, sir. So since you have justified the bigger picture in regards of the human rights to health solidarity in the era of healthcare commercialization, now I would like to ask the smaller picture. Like, what are the things that we can do as a society to directly balance the essence and the existence between our human rights in health solidarity and medical commercialization? Considering that there's lots of speculations and assumptions that the concept of bringing healthcare to commercialization is often viewed as if people who are in desperate of medical care is considered as a business subject rather than a human rights subject. And in today's meeting, we are specifically talking about the solidarity of, the human rights that every human deserves. So what are your insights in regards to this question? Thank you.
Thank you for this great question, Sekar. And I think that if I would need to emphasize something, it would be that the point that I was mentioning from Professor Adria about the incentives. I think that what is crucial is to think even from a tax point of view, what are the incentives of those that are in a privileged position, the rich more in general, to build a healthcare system that is accessible for all. And I don't think that those incentives exist if they are essentially going to be serving their needs in a system that has been especially designed for them with the participation of the state. That is also the critical point here, that if the rich serve their needs in a healthcare system that is especially designed for them, we all know it might have different names or it may have different shapes, but we all know in developing countries, Chile as much as Indonesia, that the rich serve their needs in particular clinics that are usually not open to the entirety of the population because of the costs that are extremely high. If essentially they can do that by virtue of Indonesian legislation, Chilean legislation, whatever it is that it allows it, the result of that is going to be create a fabulous business, and the incentives that they will have to improve the care that is given to the middle classes, to the working classes, to everybody who is in between, will be very, very little. If we, on the contrary, want to create societies that are integrated, that are socially cohesive, that are run on the basis of the principle of solidarity, that put an accent in not trying to make the gap between the rich and poor too large, we should focus on the building of a national healthcare system that is accessible to all and that is well coordinated. Also intra-government and also in itself. So many other policies that the government runs, this is the so-called health in all policies approach, have an impact on health. I've been talking here exclusively about healthcare. I should have begun saying that at the beginning, but health is much bigger than healthcare. And there are many things that have an impact on our health. And today there is this approach that essentially puts a lot of emphasis in the individual, in the responsibility of the individual. And I think that there is a lot to be said about that, but it should not be the result of this discussion, that in the end you are responsible for your own health. If tobacco companies, which is tobacco related problems is a huge issue in Indonesia, if they are able to make advertisement in the way that they are able, that has a direct impact with how much people consume tobacco. So this is not something that is exclusively associated with why don't you just quit smoking. It's a much more larger holistical problem. So I think that from the point of view of healthcare, public healthcare is a really big solution. Now, this is just a very general remark. How do you actually concretize that? There are several models. We have in Latin America the social medicine model, and Cuba is a country that gives important lessons in this regard. What they have is a system that is based very much on primary healthcare. So I think it's every 500 inhabitants, there is a healthcare centrum. I can give you later a nice video, a nice documentary that was made by Helen Jaffe, who is a scholar at the London School of Economics, who has written recently a book about Cuba and made this documentary about how the healthcare system works in Cuba, also in line with the problem of the pandemic. And it's a very efficient system. The doctors there know also the population very well. They have traced them on the basis of the problems that they have, and they can have a system that is very much focused on prevention, which is a way to actually save money. If your system is focused on curative treatment, yeah, that makes a lot of money, especially for those that run it under the private perspective, but it's not the most cost-effective system. If on the contrary, you try to avoid people falling into certain diseases or into bad health habits, you actually save a lot of money. But for that, you need coordination. For that, you need a system that is large enough to actually have a picture of what is going on. And at the same time, this can live together with this decentralization that I was saying, at least in the context of Cuba, because here in the Netherlands, decentralization means a very different thing. I'm not going to enter into that, but it is just to tell you how complicated this is and how one word can mean completely different things. So in the context of Indonesia, I think that the People's Health Movement is also very active. It's an organization that I think has this perspective in mind and in their hearts. And I think it's very important to follow. Regarding this situation of access to medicines, which is today so crucial in the context of this pandemic, I think that one crucial discussion that faces the North and the South is whether or not the North is actually going to do the right thing, as simple as that. The South has been pushing for a flexibility on the TRIPS agreement regarding the possibility to manufacture drugs that will help us with this pandemic. But the countries in the North do not want it because they want to protect the big corporations that want to sell this medicine. So this is a huge problem that is confronting us as a humanity. What we are seeing today is that richer countries prefer vaccine nationalism. They purchase lots of vaccines from corporations, and they have it to solve the needs of their populations first and foremost. That gives political leaders popularity. Depending, it becomes like a context. The Netherlands is better than France. France is better than Britain, and so it goes. But that's a very silly game, because actually, the more that we do not take this issue upon all of us, what happens is that the virus mutates and becomes more and more complicated, and our drugs become more and more ineffective. So if you do not tackle this problem with a global focus, you actually will not deal with it. So solidarity is something that works not just at the national level, but also at the international level, and that should reorient global policies in that respect. Unfortunately, there is today not enough political willingness, but this is a goal worth fighting for, I would say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eduardo, in regards of the justification for the answer of my question. So from hearing of your answer, we can conclude that, and we can also concretely conclude that there is still contradictory between the higher class and also the lower class in regards of the specialization of the healthcare amongst the ones who are in need. And what I'm trying to say who are the ones in need are basically anyone from any class, really, but still there is still contradictions, and there is always a problem in regards of people trying to get healthcare, people trying to obtain the medications that they need equally. And hopefully that there will always be a stronger political willingness in terms of handling this type of problems and also disputes, because apparently these type of issues is not only happening in my country but also in a lots of countries globally around the world. So in regards of your answer, thank you very much. It really gave me an enlightenment of the speculations and the thoughts that I have been thinking recently in terms of, commercializing the healthcare amongst the countries globally across the world. So now the time has shown 4:30 p.m. afternoon in Indonesia, and also in the west part of Indonesia is 5:30 p.m. as well. So we would like to conclude the webinar today. And before that, we would like to also offer to Dr. Eduardo to give his closing remarks in regards of this webinar. So Dr. Eduardo, the time and place is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing this wonderful activity. It's really been an honor to be together with you. I have written this book with my eyes and heart in the South. Not to say that many of the things that are here being said are not applicable to the global North, but I think that if the South were to follow these recipes, so many more problems would be confronted. Among them, the rise of the far right, certainly inequality and global threats that we are facing today, and the building of cohesive societies. So thank you so much for your attention. My biggest regards to my friend Luluk, to the Dean and to the university authorities, to you, Sekar, for your great comments, to all those that have participated, and hopefully to make this the beginning of an ongoing conversation and collaboration with colleagues in Indonesia and in your university in particular. So thank you so much for hosting me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eduardo. It's a pleasure for us, for you to be here in this webinar and giving all of these amazing information in regards of healthcare issues that has been occurring on our daily lives today. And also here, we would like to also thank everyone that has contributed in this webinar. Thank you so much to Prof. Ayu and also Paluluk to also be here. And thank you so much for all of you that has been taking your time out of your busy personal and professional schedules to be here and to contribute with us and discuss with us in terms of with one of the most important issue that has been revolving around in our lives. And also I would like to also remind to the audience that there is also the link to note down your absence in this webinar. So it'll be really good if you go to the link and fill in your names and also your institution there, so we know that you actually attended the webinar. And all of that, thank you so much for coming to this webinar, and I wish you all a happy afternoon and a happy good morning right there in Mr. Eduardo's place. Thank you very much and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edu. Thank you, Mbak
Thank you so
Sekar.
much.
Hey, Bu.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Terima kasih Bapak Ibu semua.
Ya, terima kasih.
Bye. Okay.
Dr. Eduardo, Prof. Ayu,
Ya, Prof.
moderator.
Edi. Thank you, Prof. Edi.
Thank you. Saya lu baru-baru saya di perjalanan.
Ya, terima kasih, Prof.
Oke, terima kasih, Prof. Ayu, Dr. Eduardo. Thank you very much. See you again.
Thank you all. All the best. We keep in touch.
Okay.
I go now.
Yeah.